Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth.
And welcome to Presence. I'm Doug King. I'll be your host for this series, and I'm very excited for this new series that we're going to have on science and spirituality, and specifically with regard to the world of science. We're going to be talking about a concept known as the Holomovement. Now, we put out in previous newsletters, Facebook and otherwise, an article, an e-publication that has just come out that I'm very excited about, because I have authored that along with Dr. Jude Currivan, an Oxford physicist, Dr. Kurt Johnson, evolutionary biologist, and Dr. Robert Atkinson, author of Our Moment of Choice. So the question is, why are we doing something with the biblical narrative and science? Well, first of all, when I have studied for many years, as I do in this work that we do at Presence, I've always had a keen interest in the relationship of science and spirituality. And the reason for this is because if you think about in the biblical narrative, the very first thing we know about God is that God manifested, created that which is known as the heavens and the earth, or the universe. So doesn't it really stand to reason that the very first thing we know about the nature of God, not as a person, but as source, we're going to talk about that, because God has a whole lot of baggage, that term that's been presented, but we're talking, and we'll use different terms as we go along, indicating God certainly beyond personage. But the nature of God was first shown to us in the universe itself. So the nature of the universe is actually that which preceded everything else that's told in the biblical narrative story. So doesn't it make sense that the story of God's nature, as it's revealed in this narrative, in this biblical narrative, should align itself with the nature of the universe, which came from the source described as God in the biblical narrative? So the question for the series immediately is, if you're watching this or listening to it on a podcast, and let me say that we've had a number of people request that we put this also, when we do these video casts, that we also put the audio into a podcast, because there are a lot of people that are going for walks, they're driving in their car, they're doing other things, and they say, is there any way you can just put this in audio form? So we do. We have both. We have an audio podcast going, and then the video cast. And I bring this up right now because those of you who are simply listening to the podcast, I've got 3 diagrams I'll be going through today that correlate to the article and the diagrams that are in the article about the Holomovement. And you can find those diagrams then if you go to YouTube and watch this at a time when it's convenient for you. So there are diagrams involved. I'll do my best to describe them. Who's our audience? Who is it that we would think? Who has an interest in the biblical narrative as Holomovement? And what is Holomovement? So we will talk about those things in detail here in a sec. I'll get into defining these things. But first and foremost, the audience that I'm really working with is, to start with, the evolutionary leaders. You can find evolutionaryleaders.net for information about this group. I've talked about this group several times and in many other podcasts and videocasts. But if you're new to Presence and you're new to this series, you can go to evolutionaryleaders.net. It's a group right now that consists of 240 people or so. These are internationally known speakers, authors, activists, that are in all parts of the globe. And they are the ones who were behind the e-publication that we put out and that you all read. The people that were part of the writing of this from the science side, as well as my integral approach to theology, are all part of the evolutionary leaders. And the 240 people are divided into different synergy groups so that the leaders can get together in common causes that may relate to business, economics, finance, or it might be the arts. And so you might have people that are poets and painters, musicians, and others that are in that group with their common interests and the way they see contributing to world change. Or you've got people in philosophy, or like Presence, we're bringing an integral approach to theology. And there are many other synergy groups represented. So it's a very powerful movement. It's growing, and it is very much a part of the audience that I'm working with. The second part of it is a group known as Theology Without Walls. Theology Without Walls is part of the American Academy of Religion. The American Academy of Religion meets once a year. The last one I went to was in San Antonio, Texas, at the Convention Center, because this American Academy of Religion meeting yearly is enormous. Literally, people from all over the globe attend this. When I attended, there were 10,000 people there, representing theologians and spiritual leaders from a number of different religions. But certainly, there was an overwhelming number of theologians who were in different tracks and sessions that had to do with all kinds of specific elements of the biblical narrative, specific elements of theology. These are people that you will find teaching in seminaries. And this is why I'm very keen on the Theology Without Walls group, because they have such a heavy influence in the material that's taught to the pastors, who then teach the material to congregations. And that's the way the hierarchy works within the religion Christianity. So I'm very keen on talking with them. Why? Because what we're proposing is a dramatic and radical paradigm change. We are challenging a 2,000-year-old paradigm that's been handed down since the Roman Empire with regard to the interpretation of Christology as a religion. We'll get into this a lot more as we go along the way, but I just simply want you to be aware that the material in this is part of a worldwide discussion and an evolutionary movement that is very much alive and taking place. In fact, if you look at what's happening with religion here in the United States, the fastest growing segment of the spirituality category, if you will, is the movement called spiritual but not religious, SBNR, spiritual but not religious. Sometimes you will see groups of people referred to as the nuns, N-O-N-E, nuns, meaning non-affiliated. So something is happening. And even beyond that, if you look at seminaries, we talked about seminaries, they're having difficulty keeping themselves afloat financially. Congregations are having a difficult time finding pastors. And many church buildings are closing. I saw a number from Pew Research, I believe it was, I think last year here in the United States, some 4,000 churches closed. There's something going on. And furthermore, if we say, well, what does the future hold? According to Barna Research, as well as Pew Research, when we look at the 18 to 30-year-olds, the generation that is now taking leadership positions for our future, that group is very much non-affiliated. They are not members of a religion, and we're going to talk specifically from the biblical narrative about the world's largest religion, Christianity. So when we talk about this Holomovement in science, what we're saying is that the future of the biblical narrative is not going to be found in old paradigms handed down by 2,000-year-old thinking, but rather we're going to see that even in science, the paradigms that were long held in science are currently being turned on their heads. And I'm inviting in and working with scientists because I want this project, this series, and the things that I write to have the credibility of science behind it. I am not a quantum physicist. I am not an evolutionary biologist. And that's why I'm working with people in those fields. So that's what we're bringing to this. And this is the audience. And lastly, let me just say this. If you are a person that is very comfortable in your particular denomination, then this is not a series that will probably work for you. And we're not attempting to debate, argue, or try to force someone into this discussion. So if you find this discussion something that just doesn't apply to you and you're very happy with your denomination, and there are thousands of them, this is the issue with Christianity, of course, is that it is defined, if you will, by the denomination a person is in, which means a Christian is defined by the way they separate themselves from all others. We'll get into that in a lot more detail here in a little bit. But let's start out looking at my notes here. Why would we consider this? Genesis 1, that's the nature of God. It should be telling us something. Now, what I want to do now is to go ahead and share some diagrams. And again, that's what we're doing. We're pulling up diagrams to define now the Holomovement and to show why it relates to the biblical narrative and aligns itself beautifully with the biblical narrative. So I'm going to start with a basic chart. You'll find this chart, this diagram, in the e-publication that we put out in the newsletter. It's up on our Facebook page. You can still get it. There's no charge for it. It's published by the Evolutionary Leaders Publishing Group. In fact, one of the synergy circles in Evolutionary Leaders is a media group, and there are people who are professionals in media who donate their time to editing, publishing, and so forth. And so Light on Light is the publishing source for this, and I'm very grateful for them. And they make this available at no charge. One of the activisms that we're involved in is paradigm activism. And you'll hear that term a lot more because paradigm activism is alive and well, not only here in the movement forward of biblical interpretation, but it's very much alive in terms of science and other fields as well. But let's look at this chart. Okay, Holomovement. What is the Holomovement? Well, first of all, it relates to the nature of the universe with regard to two orders. And we put these two orders into a Venn diagram. In case you're listening to this, I have a Venn diagram. The circle on the left says explicate. The circle on the right says implicate. Those are the two orders that make up our universe. There's an implicate order and explicate order. What is that? Well, the explicate order refers to the realm of forms or things. This is the way our external universe is described by people in physics. This is a term going back to David Bohm and his work in the last century. We'll talk about him a little bit more here in a moment. So the explicate world is simply things like planets, stars, solar systems, galaxies. All of these things are part of an explicate world. These things at one time did not exist, but they came into existence. Formally, the term used for this is Big Bang, but Dr. Caravan will be on with us next week to talk about this charge, and she will explain the concept of it rather being a big breath. I'll let Jude go into that. Well, what is it then that's the source of the explicate order? In other words, where did these forms or things originate, or how were they manifested? This is where quantum physics is saying that there is an implicate order that lies behind and is the source for the explicate order. This was a huge move forward in science. How did that happen? Well, the way it happened was science had been confined really to the explicate order, because the explicate order is based on time and space. We're all familiar with light years as the amount of time to travel through X amount of space. And so the explicate order is literally that order that can be observed, it can be measured, it can be quantified, because it is a universe, again, and you'll hear this over and over, I'll use the term forms or things. However, time and space defined this explicate order for many, many years. Even Albert Einstein's laws of relativity still were based on the speed of light and the laws that pertained to forms and things. But David Bohm began to do some experimentation and some mathematical formulations that were challenging this particular way of understanding our universe as the complete and only way to understand it. So, in this, he came up with a theory of non-locality, which later is now proven, and it is a principle, an absolute principle of our universe. And I've got the definition of it here. The principle of non-locality in quantum mechanics says that quantum particles can know the states of other quantum particles, even at great distances, and correlate their behaviors with each other instantaneously. It is instantaneous action at a distance. In other words, particles can correlate their behavior, this is proven, even if they are thousands of light years apart. They can do it instantaneously. What does this mean? It means that there lies an order or realm beyond time and space. Oh, this is a game changer. Non-locality indicates there's something behind our explicate order of the universe that we are able to see. This implicate source would relate in the biblical narrative to that which we would understand as the space of God, God's space. There are other ways that this is also brought out in the biblical narrative. For example, the explicate order, Genesis 1:1, you have the heavens and the earth. That would be this left-hand circle of form. And within that, there evolves a whole world of forms, and those forms come from Moses, the law, the temple, and many forms that we're going to talk about as an explicate order. And yet we know that behind that it was manifested from the source which the narrative calls God. Therefore, from an order that transcends the explicate order of forms and things, and that is called a new heaven and new earth. So you have the heavens and the earth that begin the narrative, and then as the narrative comes to an end, there is entrance into a new heaven and a new earth, which shows an implicate order and an explicate order, which is identical to the order of our universe. That the biblical narrative, two orders, align themselves perfectly with the explicate and implicate orders of our universe, which are not theoretical, but are proven in fact. We will refer to this as biblical cosmology, and we'll have a lot to say in this series about biblical cosmology. Now, what is the process called the Holomovement? That's where we go to the middle of the Venn diagram. The Holomovement, holo means whole, and it is the movement of the whole. What is the whole? W-H-O-L-E. The whole is the implicate and explicate. The reason it's diagrammed in a Venn is because these two are not separated. They are interconnected, they are relational, and they represent a holistic, W-H-O-L, a holistic universe that is both implicate and explicate. Just as there is God and universe, but you can't separate God from the universe. And that's why we're doing this study. You can't do that. What is the movement? The movement of the Holomovement is in the middle of the Venn, and that's where the action takes place. And there are two directions of movement. One is an informing movement. And in this diagram, I show it as moving from the implicate. What happens? From the implicate, there is an informing action that leads to an explicate order or our universe. Our universe was formed through an informing action. Dr. Curvon will explain this in far greater detail when she's on next week. By the same token, I'm going to go to the biblical narrative and show that the explicate order of biblical cosmology, which preceded the new heavens and earth, or the implicate order of biblical cosmology, was also a God informing action. And just to make sure that we start this series off with a real bang, if you will, I am going to immediately take issue with a long-held sacred cow of Christianity. We'll get to that a couple weeks from now, but it has to do with God and the informing process resulting in the explicate order that preceded the coming of the implicate. So to have this universe, it starts with some type of informing, some type of big breath, some type of action that resulted in a whole universe of forms. All right, that's one of the actions of the Holomovement. But the other is the movement from the explicate order into the implicate order. In other words, in caveman science, a rock was simply a rock. It was a concretized form, literally. However, as we got into deeper and deeper knowledge of science, we began to realize, wait a minute, this rock that appears to be a concretized form is actually made up of atoms. And then as quantum physics came along and they looked further, even behind the atoms, of that rock, they begin to see, wait a minute, if you go beyond that, you begin to get into particles and waves and wave theory. Now what's happening? What's happening is when you look at something in the explicate, while it does have form, and while that form has boundaries, the closer you look at it and the more you look into it, the more you are going into a transform mode, because you're going beyond the concretized form and you're realizing there's something behind that is actually, when you come down to it, is nothing more than a bunch of waves, particles, etc. Again, that's why I'm bringing in quantum physicists to talk to us more about that. That is a transform, going beyond form into the implicate. And this is where you're headed towards that which is formless. Formlessness would apply to the new heaven and earth. It's formless. It's not geographical. It can't be measured. You can't say, here it is, there it is. God, spirit, all of these belong to the implicate realm, and these are formless because they can't be measured. They can't be seen with a telescope, microscope, etc. So the movement from form into the implicate order is very much going to be a transformative topic of Jesus and the apostolic writers. We're going to find them in the middle of the Venn, and they are very much going to be associated with that which is transformed. And the problem of what's been handed down for the last 2,000 years is a Christology that was initially interpreted as simply a new form and was not understood in its role and function as actually rather being transformed. That makes a dramatic and radical difference in the way we understand our nature and the nature of all humans on this planet. So when you are moving in the transform direction, that's called an enfolding process. I think I failed to mention that in the first diagram, that when you are going through informing, then that's an unfolding process. The universe is unfolding. However, when you move from the explicate world of forms, you are going transform, and that is called an enfolding process. So the Holomovement is the movement found in the center of the Venn, and it is the movement that moves from the implicate to the explicate in an unfolding manner, and it is a movement that goes from the explicate to the implicate in an enfolding manner. And if this does not make sense to you, perhaps it would be better said if I termed it that the process of change, even within you, starts with an informing process, and that informing leads to transforming. That you are not transformed. You don't change unless something first informs you. So we're going to talk about this a lot. So basically, even though I'm talking cosmology and the whole universe and whatever, the other thing I really want to bring out here is that this is also the movement behind human nature. So let me move on to this last chart. And we brought this up before in many of our presence discussions in the past, and that is identity versus role and function. And this is very critical. That which with which I identify is extremely important, and it will either lead me to separation paradigms, or it will lead me to paradigms of unity. That's why this discussion is very critical, The things I'm going through today are the real basic ABCs of the Holomovement. And if you hang in there with me, we will get into theology, we will get into the biblical narrative, and we will see how you can either move to a divided Christology or one that points us into unity and the basis of it, and whether or not it aligns with the nature of God, because if it aligns with the nature of God, it will align with the universe that was created by God. So you have interconnected the two orders as we show here. The implicate order is identity. Why is that? Why is the implicate order identity? Because that's the source. Our source is our identity. This is why Jesus used the symbol or metaphor of Father. Father was a common way of describing identity 2,000 years ago, because one's identity was through genealogy, and the head of the family per the male was what determined that. And so father was a very common way to do that. And so father or parent and child would be another way of saying it, where parent is the identity because parent is source. God is source, the way the biblical narrative tells the story. The implicate realm is the source, and those in science are now seeing a very much a spirituality that applies to this universe, a consciousness that applies to this universe, that these quantum fields and these quantum experiments are pointing to. Now, this creates interconnectivity in that the explicate world is full of diversity. Again, not just planets and stars and those kinds of things, but look at the planet Earth. Look at the diversity we have in terms of nations, in terms of nationalities, diversity in many different ways that exists here on the planet. Now, the question is, are we able to understand diversity as unity versus diversity as separation? And that is why the discussion will be on role and function. Diversity is not the realm where I find my identity. My identity is not male. My identity is not Caucasian. My identity is not American, etc., etc. My identity is not husband or father. Those are roles and functions. That shows great diversity in my own life and diversity across our globe. But that is not my identity. My identity comes from source, and source is what I understand to be that which the biblical narrative calls God. That is source, that is identity. Again, we've talked about this before. But when we look at it in this particular flow, we see that both source, which cannot be divided, and diversity, which is understood in light of its different divided roles and functions, are still all one. They are still one. Just as Jesus says, the Father and I are one. The universe and all within our global human family has an identity that is based on source, same source for all the diversity of human life on this planet. Therefore, the source of identity of all human beings is one. So, I'm going to go back and wrap up this session by pointing us to where we're going to go next week, because we're going to start going through these diagrams where I'm going to bring in people from science on the one hand And then I'm going to go to the biblical narrative on the other hand, and I'm going to show how all of this and the nature of nature is the same in the God story of the biblical narrative as it is in the science story of our universe. And why would it be this way? Why is it important that we know that? Because God is in all. God is all in all. We have gone through that for decades here. And if God is all in all, God is no less science than God is anything that we find as we go through the biblical narrative. It should all align itself on all levels, be they scientific or spiritual. And to separate these things or to say they're not important really takes us back to the Dark Ages when people in religion, specifically Christianity, didn't want any part of scientific discussions. What? You're saying that the earth revolves around the sun? Why, that's heresy, declared religious people who knew nothing about science, but they had come up with that conclusion that, in fact, it was religion and religion only that had all the answers to all these things. Next week, we're going to have Dr. Jude Curve on. I'll have her bio in the newsletter. She's going to come on, and we're going to talk about the informing of our universe. It's fascinating because informing is based on information. How is our universe then nothing more than information? Wow, that is a very exciting question, and it will lead us again into how did, in fact, God inform the explicate order when it came to Moses, the law, and the things that make up that first heaven and earth, if you will, that first explicate order that eventually was going to enter into a transform process, which we'll get to further down the line when we talk specifically about the Gordian knot of all Gordian knots, Christology. So we will get to that. So, hey, thanks for joining us in this study. If you have questions, send them to info@presence.com. We'll do our best to address them as we go throughout the series here. Other than that, I hope that you have a good rest of the day, good rest of the week, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.